Morning, everyone. We are here once again for a roundtable discussion, our monthly roundtable discussion under the banner of CSA, Council for Strategic Affairs. And we have a very interesting topic today. The topic for today's discussion is a paper written by Ambassador Vijay Gokhale for Carnegie India website. And the title of the paper was Stabilizing the Border, a Possible Way Ahead in the Post-Galwan situation. This paper came, I think, around December 15, 2023, and today is January 13, 2024. So we'll have a roundtable discussion based on this particular paper, and we have very loaded panel of distinguished experts. So our panel includes 3 people, and I will come and introduce them later on. A little bit about Council for Strategic Affairs. Council imparts education in the field of international relations. CSA fosters discussion, dialogue, and debate on geopolitical issues. CSA encourages strategic studies in general to raise the level of awareness. We condemn terrorism in all its forms worldwide. The CSA aims to contribute towards world peace and prosperity. And the Council promotes people-to-people contact and track to diplomacy. A little bit about our activities. We have a monthly roundtable discussion that we are having today. Usually it is second Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern Daytime. We have a monthly guest lecture by a domain expert on fourth Saturday of each month. There's a new series of one-on-one interviews, strategically speaking with Dr. Adityanji. We also organize symposia, meetings, and conferences. We promote publication of articles on geopolitics and related subjects. We have a summer internship program for college students and a fellowship training program in strategic studies. So let me come to our experts, and you will be seeing them. This is Brigadier Arun Sagal, who does not need any introduction. He works with Delhi Policy Group. He is the Executive Director of Forum for Strategic Initiatives. He has done quite a lot of work in his active duty, 36 years of career in Indian Army, followed by, post-retirement. He has been, I would say, the guru or the dean of contemporary strategic thinking in India. I'm not going to go through all these introductions for the simple reason that I want to focus more on the topic and the discussion. So my apologies to my panelists. They are so well known that they don't require introduction from me. Our second panelist is Major General Dhruv Katoch. And again, I'll take the same approach. He has been, in active duty, followed by, he worked for the IDSA. He was the director of IDSA, and now he works for Vivekananda International Foundation. And again, he is very well known, very well authored, also works for India Foundation. So we will skip the description of his career and go on to the third panelist, who is Ambassador Anil Trigunayat. Anil Trigunayat was a professional Indian diplomat for more than 3 decades. After retirement, he is working with various think tanks, including Vivekananda International Foundation. He is very active, giving lectures and talks, etc. So I'm going to come now straight to the subject. In fact, this was the picture used by Carnegie India to discuss the particular topic. But here you see the line of actual control, some of the details where we are having the problems. So this gives you the line of control with the Pakistan occupied territory that is here. People sometimes get confused between line of control and line of actual control. Line of actual control is with so-called Chinese territory. Actually, it is China-occupied Tibet. We have line of control. This is the kind of western sector, then the middle sector, and then the eastern sector. Again, line of actual control. And these are the two areas there is still eyeball to eyeball confrontation with China post-Galwan 2020, Depsong, and Demchok. So Ambassador Vijay Gokhale in this paper states that an abnormal situation continues to prevail along the India-China line of control 3 years after Galwan Valley incident, despite bilateral talks to resolve the matter. Although progress is being made, the force levels on both sides and close proximity in which they are deployed increase the chances of a deadly mishap or unintended encounter. And he states that this paper examines the reason why existing agreement and measures between India and China to preserve peace and tranquility along the LAC were not entirely successful, how both sides may deal with border stabilization in post-2020 scenario, and the possible options for India to build back a framework for peace and tranquility. Before I invite my panelists, a couple of housekeeping rules. I expect everyone who is joining to keep themselves on mute to avoid noise interference. Change the cell phone to vibration mode. When our esteemed panelists are speaking, don't interrupt them. At the end of this, there will be time to ask questions. Only those who are openly asking questions will be allowed to ask questions. No anonymous questioners, please. All the questions are moderated through the chat room. Please be very precise and specific in asking questions and don't send detailed comments. Lastly, this program is being recorded. It is also being live streamed on our YouTube channel. It will be available as a permanent resource material on our website. So without further ado, I'm going to start with the discussion, roundtable discussion. Each of our panelists will have around 10 minutes to make an opening statement. This will be followed by a phase of moderated discussion. And lastly, we will have questions from the audience. So the whole exercise will last around 1.5 hours. And it's my honor and pleasure to invite Brigadier. And it's my honor and pleasure to invite Brigadier Arun Sagal. There seems to be some echo, so I'm going to put myself on mute and give the platform to Brigadier Sagal. Brigadier Sagal. Kindly unmute yourself, Brigadier Sagal. You are muted. Kindly unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Saab, for giving me this opportunity. I have been delving with this subject for some time now, particularly on the issue of status quo and status quo ante, particularly with regard to our borders. From my perspective, Ambassador's brief has made some very constructive and far-reaching suggestions analyzing the current scenario. But there are two critical factors that have not been addressed ever since the May 2020 Chinese incursion. First fundamental point is, what was the driver of intrusion in Ladakh and even earlier in Doklam? What are the Chinese trying to gain? That's an issue that we need to ask her. What are their strategic objectives? We can only go to resolving issues once we understand what the issue is. Second issue is that one word which has been constantly occurring in every single discourse of ours with the Chinese is the word of trust. And every time there is an incident or there is an issue, The word trust is the one which is always said to be missing. So the question basically arises why there is no trust between us. The third issue is there are the different perspectives of our thinking as of the current scenario. As far as India is concerned, we are very clear till such time the intrusion is vacated and status quo ante prevails. That is, status prior to May 2020 prevails. There can be no bilateral dialogue. In fact, this issue has been restated by our external minister at a dialogue in Nagpur only today. Today it has happened. This is a news report of the issue. As far as the Chinese are concerned, Chinese say border issue is a legacy issue. This will resolve on its own. We will continue our discussions on its own. But in the meantime, let us move forward and continue with our bilateral relations and build a strong bilateral cooperative mechanisms. So basically, this thing is, India says vacate and discuss, and the Chinese says discuss and possibly we will vacate. That's the difference between the two issues. Now, coming to the main points raised by Ambassador Gokhale in his thing. His first element of his paper talks about why measures and existing agreement to preserve peace and tranquility have not entirely been successful. He talks about the three-stage formula, that is of disengage, de-escalate, and de-induction. And he also talks about is that in this whole resolution of this whole issue, the centerpiece revolves around trust as a main element. Then he also talks about the need for credible deterrence and adequate resources. He has suggested some very interesting building blocks, which are good negotiations perspectives, primarily, and here again there is a very interesting facet. The entire logic and his focus is on border management and resolution of problems, border issues, but not of broader of conflict resolution. We have not talked about conflict. We are not talking about border resolution. We are not nowhere in this paper he talks about border resolution. He talks about okay, we can improve relationship, we'll reduce tensions, etc., etc. But border resolution as an issue is not being discussed. Now, this brings me to my basic issue. We have to understand why the Chinese took the actions. I mean, we can only discuss with the Chinese if we understand where are they coming from. And that is an important issue because we had to understand the Chinese actions which have led to this. First question we have to ask is boundary issue a standalone issue or is a larger perspective of the Chinese perception about India, essentially to keep India unbalanced? I mean, is China continuing with a border issue to keep India unbalanced, or it is merely an issue of management of a boundary? That's something which we need to look at, because if you look at the LAC line of control with Pakistan is a different issue. Here it is border is being used to unbalance India. Now, second issue is that the perceptions of powers, perceptions of China and United and India. As far as the perceptions are concerned, we need to be very clear. Both powers, both India and China, have regional ambitions of great power ambitions. China wants to create a Sino-centric Asia. India's rise and strategic alignment, therefore, are seen as impacting Chinese regional predominance. That's an important issue. We need to take cognizance of that. China wants to be an undisputed regional power and sees US as a peer competitor. So correlation of India and United States is seen as a red bull by the Chinese. And the boundary issue, in my perception, is symptomatic of the rising ambitions for both without compromise. Therefore, the issue today basically is, as far as a boundary is concerned, both countries, given their strategic perspective, given the perception of their own global and a regional role, cannot compromise or cannot seem to be compromising on this standoff. And therefore, both sides have built up a large amount of forces, upgraded capacities, upgraded capabilities. We have launched a large number of programs to upgrade our weapons systems, etc., etc., etc. So bottom line today is this, is that is where the whole situation stands. Now, if this be the scenario, how do we come to some kind of an understanding with the Chinese? What is it that will... So that brings me to my second issue. What is the China's overall strategy? China's basic strategy, as far as LSA is concerned, is military build-up and continue to put India on the defensive. And like they have said all along in their earlier negotiations, even the ambassador talks about how they were negotiating with the Russians. The bottom line basically is that there will be no compromise other than on Chinese terms. And second thing is Chinese acceptance of conflict resolution is not to resolve the conflict, but to buy time to reinforce their strength and capabilities. So this is something which we need to understand. Therefore, it's important for India to understand on terms on which Chinese will agree to either disengage or de-induct. Or de-induction is, of course, is a different issue. Let me now provide a perspective what exists on the LSE from my view. In terms of operational and strategic compulsions, both sides are by and large reasonably balanced. The days that we were on a disadvantage are no longer prevailing. We saw that happening when we did that Kailash Range operations. We saw the narrative which is now coming out from General Nirvane's book in August 2021, that what happened as an armor standoff that took place. So I use a term called usable power and effective power. There is no point in talking about what SIPRI talks about, the Chinese capability, capacities, etc., etc. How much is the power can Chinese leverage? In my view, the status that obtains in Ladakh at this point in time is the leverageable power will be in the range of 45 to 55. There is no great strategic advantage that can China have. On top of that, the Chinese have to maintain forces which are not really in the best, in comparison to India, are not that robust for dealing or staying on in these situations. The turnover frequencies of the Chinese are much higher. the casualty rate, which are not talked about in the global press, but if you go deeper into the Chinese literature, you will get to know there are a huge amount of casualties, and the morale of the Chinese, as we have now seen in the number of reports that are coming out, is pretty low. So the question basically arises is that how long can China maintain status quo? That is the present scenario. There are only two ways it can go. And this is something which we need to understand. One way is that China agrees to climb down and push the envelope from status quo incrementally towards status quo ante, or escalate. Both have serious strategic implications for China. If it de-escalates on terms which are not in Chinese favor or indicate the compromise by the Chinese, then the issue is, what were they doing all these years for? If they escalate, the issue for the Chinese is this: is escalation to what extent, and the consequences of escalation, given the fact that today Indian capacities and capabilities are incrementally increasing. We have a whole range of access, from electronic warfare, asymmetric warfare, space warfare. Our people simply don't read enough to understand what are the kind of capabilities that India is developing. India is becoming a hugely strong military capable power. Just to give you an example, we have a Cartosat satellite, Cartosat 3, which will give you full-time 24/7 information. The second issue basically is this. The problem for the Chinese is this at this point in time is, what is the face saver? Now, here comes the problem area for us. What is the face saver we can provide the Chinese? Or can we provide a face saver to the Chinese? I mean, for de-induction, disengagement, yes, ho gaya. Depsang planes, Chumar, we are sitting over there. They are trying to, but that's again an issue which is from a tactical perspective a very this thing. But as we are all aware, and if your people who are attending are not aware, apart from the DBO road, Ashok DBO road, we are building another road via the glaciers. The second road is being built around the glaciers, which basically will mean that we will have multiple access routes. And it's only a matter of time we'll have multiple access routes. Added to that, we have upgraded our entire infrastructure. And in another 5 to 7 years, we will probably have a railway line coming up to Ladakh. So, force build-up capacity capabilities are increasing stupendously by us. To us, there is no hurry. I mean, we have already amortized the costs of 50 to 60,000 troops which are deployed in front of the Chinese. So therefore, my suggestion, my deep conviction is that India does not have to compromise the Chinese. We should be very clear to the Chinese that we are willing to discuss. De-induction or disengagement is the first step. On this issue of neutral zones and lack of patrolling, etc., etc. I mean, even the ambassador talks about the fact that we should not, we should be careful, etc. We need to be very careful, extremely careful. And we, while discussing the disengagement, the Indian side has to be very clear what is the end state that we are looking at. What is it, the end state of de-induction that we are looking at? What does it mean? There is another element which we need to focus on. There is an infrastructure which the both sides have already built. Okay, so earlier the Chinese were about 30 to 40 kilometers behind. and we were about 60 to 80 kilometers behind. But now we have come much closer. The infrastructure is built, it's there. We're not going to pull back from those infrastructure. So that has brought us much more closer to each other with force capabilities. We're talking about Vajra being 100 kilometer on. We're talking about laser guided weapon systems. And there's one more element which we need to understand is this, that as long as status quo continues and the Chinese remain deployed over here, the pressure on resolution is not entirely on India. It is equal pressure on resolution on the Chinese, because the questions are being raised within China. What are we gaining from this long thing? Like I said, there are two, three schools in China. One is Teach India Lesson School, but there are pragmatic schools, which talks about the fact is that we are taking our focus away from the primary direction. The primary direction with challenge from United States in East China Sea and the whole Taiwan issue, which, as we know today, is going to get further impetus with the DPP winning the elections. The question, therefore, is this: is that the nuances of resolutions can always be discussed. My broad point is the terms of resolution we have to be very clear about. And I think we ought to be very clear that if we have to de-escalate, we need to be very clear on the terms and conditions, and they cannot be against India. And my last point is, and this is particularly for my friends who are sitting in the US, is that at some stage, we need to have frank, straightforward discussions with the Americans, is that in terms of escalation, what role will the United States play? We do not expect America to deploy its forces in support of us, but a kind of Ukrainian-oriented role of support system, credible support system, etc., need to be factored in. And once we factor those issues, then our strength and capacity to deal with China will increase that much. But in the interim, in my view, India is fairly poised, balanced, poised, and capable of dealing with the long-term consequences of the earlier standoff took for 7 years in Sumdrong-Chu. We can hang on for 7 years. There's not an issue with us, but we need not compromise. The interesting difference from that time to this time is that we are incrementally building our strong military capacities and capabilities. Thank you. I think I may have exceeded my time, but thank you. I rest my remarks.
Thank you, Brigadier Sagal. Very lucid discussion and your own point of views. We are not going to do questions right now, so I will invite Major General Dhruv Katoch at this juncture to give his opinion and analysis of Ambassador Vijay Gokhale's paper. So, General Katoch, the floor is yours, sir. Kindly start with your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Jitenji. Before I start, I just want a slight clarification as far as my introduction was concerned. Thank you for the introduction. But I'm not I have never been the director of IDSA. I was the director of the Center for Land Warfare Studies, and I'm not part of the Vivekananda India Foundation. I'm a director in India Foundation. But thank you for the introduction. Now, getting down to the paper proper, I won't repeat what Brigadier Sahgal has so lucidly gone through. But I just want to start from the end, really, where Ambassador Gokhale makes the point that unless trust exists between the two countries, we are not going to proceed very far. And I think that's a very valid point. Now, the question is, why is there no trust? It basically, in my view, and I've argued this point many times, is basically based on what the Chinese are looking at as far as India is concerned. And India, what is India looking at? Now, India is a status quo power. We just want to stay within our boundaries. But China doesn't think of it that way. China, as Brigadier Sahgal has pointed out, is thinking of India as a peer competitor. And when China is looking at being the number one, the sole superpower in the world, here they are finding that because of India, they cannot even become the sole superpower in Asia. So there is a fundamental difference and in the thought processes of the two countries, which is why we are not going to have an agreement. Because China will be very happy with India only when India agrees to a junior partner status. And that India will never do. So which is why you had the BPTA in 1993, the CBMA in 96, then the 2005 protocols, and then in 2013 we had the border defense cooperation agreements. Nothing has really worked. Because while there may not have been actual ground fighting, the level of distrust between the two sides is too large. And I don't see that level of distrust dissipating. Now, why? Let us say if the border was very clearly defined, perhaps there could have been some sort of an agreement. But in this case, the borders are not defined. And even if we agree at some point of time to a line of actual control, well, the Chinese may renege on that later. That is why now, for many decades, they didn't even think of Arunachal. Now they started talking of Arunachal as being Chinese territory. It is simply another pressure point being put on India. The problem with the LAC also is that there are four perceptions of the LAC. One is what India thinks is the LOC, or what India believes it to be the LOC. The second is what India believes the Chinese think of as the LAC. And similarly, what the Chinese believe is the LAC, and what the Chinese think India believes as the LAC. So these are these four variations which exist, and no solution is going to come as far as this is concerned, because on the ground, delimitation and demarcation is not going to take place. When we look at what happened in the Sumdrong-Chu incident, incidentally, that the Sumdrong-Chu is a nala. I've served there. I was a divisional commander at that area. So when you stand on the spur which India is holding, on the other side, just ahead of us, is the Sumdrong-Chu nala, and then on the hill feature, the opposite hill feature is what the Chinese are holding. Now, they came and occupied a little bit of feature on our lower slopes. There's a history to that which I don't want to get into, but to neutralize that, we went further east and we occupied Yangtze. And that has become the status quo now, because they're still holding on to the small Sumdrong-Chu area which they occupied. About 8 or 10 people stay there, and we've got a company strength in Yangtze, which is well further to the east, and we are holding those heights. Now, these sort of actions will continue to take place over the years without any resolution. So, because anybody who occupies, when you actually look at those hills, look at those mountains, these are high altitude areas, and it is very difficult to dislodge anybody who has actually occupied that area and strengthened it up. A little bit of what the Chinese have been doing, the creep mission which they keep doing, we have effectively put a stop to it now because we have resisted it. The one reason why there is no peace agreement now is because India is insisting that they go back to the pre-2019 position. Whereas earlier what we used to do is we would accept that the Chinese would come and say intrude by about 2 kilometers. We would have talks. They would go back to 1 kilometer, 1.5 kilometers, but they would retain a little bit of area. And then we would say, okay, the issue has been resolved. But the point is they have crept forward. Now we are saying there will be no resolution unless you go back and restore the status quo ante, as Brigadier Sagal so correctly brought out. Which is why I don't think anything is going to happen as far as the border is concerned in the immediate future or in the near future. what do the Chinese aim at? I think if the Chinese are aiming at domination of India, then what they are really looking at is domination of the entire Himalayan range. That is one of the reasons why they are looking at Arunachal, why they are looking at Sikkim, why they are looking at Ladakh, and one of the reasons why they took over Tibet. When you talk of Tibet and the Five Fingers, that has been a part of Mao's strategy since 1949. Now it is a different kettle of fish that India is strong enough to protect its territories. But that doesn't mean that the Chinese thought process of gaining control of the Himalayas, or at least of the crest line, has been set aside. They want to control the Himalayas because then you can control the waters which go southwards onto India and Bangladesh and other countries. And if you control the waters, you control that country. So in a larger sense, that will be the ultimate aim of China, is to get control of the complete mountain ranges to the extent where they are comfortable in holding on to that and controlling the waters which flow down from there onto the plains of India. It has been my view that for the moment, I don't see any conflict developing between India and China. And there's a reason for that. Ambassador Gokhale spoke of the trust issue. That, of course, remains. But the point is why China will not attack or not try to physically take over these territories by force, in my view, is due to one simple reason. They are not confident of success. And so long as the Indian armed forces and the political establishment is there with a strong will, there is going to be no major conflict between India and China. However, these minor transgressions, as we have seen what they attempted in Yangtze or what they are doing at certain other places, that will continue and they will be resisted. So they occupy something, we'll occupy something, and that game will continue. But ultimately, those troops are going to remain where they are, and we may prevent a serious situation from arising, but the level of distrust will continue at least for the next decade or so. What does India need to do really? A great deal has been done over the last decade in terms of infrastructure build-up, but I'm afraid a great deal more needs to be done, especially in Arunachal Pradesh. While the Tawang sector is very well taken care of, the rest of Arunachal Pradesh, when you go right down to the tri-junction between India, Tibet, and Myanmar, that entire stretch of about 800 to 1,000 kilometers, most of it is glaciated. Most of it, there is a very limited approach. But wherever there is an approach coming up, the Chinese have built a road right up to the LAC. There are many places where our roadhead is at least a few hours or a few days away. Now that remains a weakness. We need to get our communication infrastructure sorted out. That is one. Number two, should there be a conflict between India and China, the way it will progress is China will use information warfare, electronic warfare, and space warfare as the start points. Now, if that is going to be the start point, I think we have to counter it also right from now. How do we counter them in space? How do we counter them in electronic warfare and in information warfare? Those processes are on both by China and by India. But there's one thing which is very interesting, which I want to develop after this step is over. For the Chinese to launch a physical attack on those mountain features, they would require very strong air support and very strong artillery support. Now, the artillery, as far as the Chinese is concerned, will be deployed in the open because that is the plains of Tibet. In a sense, it is an advantage to them that they've got very close access to the LAC, but it's also a disadvantage because for them to hide their artillery deployment, the forward deployment, the deployment of their administrative bases is going to be very, very difficult, which is why the key feature in any conflict is going to be the Indian Air Force, or I beg your pardon, the Air Force of both the countries. And so long as the Indian Air Force can maintain an edge over the Chinese plough in Tibet, over the complete plateau of Tibet. I'm not talking about the LAC. The LAC is irrelevant when we look into a conflict, because should there be war, it is going to be fought well into the Tibetan plateau. It is not going to be fought on the LAC. It has to be fought in depth. So when we look at the Brahmaputra River, what they call the Sangpo, it will be fought even beyond that. And the Brahmaputra River is 80 to 100 kilometers from the LAC. So we are looking at a battle in depth, which will be fought by the Air Force, which will be fought with missiles and with other means. And it is only after that stage will the ground offensive start. And for the ground offensive to be successful, as far as the Chinese are concerned, they need to have air dominance. As of now, they don't have that air dominance. But it is my feeling that if they feel they have the requisite degree of air superiority and ground superiority, they will go in for an offensive. Not at the moment. In space, Brigadier Sahgal has mentioned about the great progress which we have made. This year itself, 5 satellites are being launched to keep an eye on our borders. And this will be 24-hour surveillance. So our space capabilities, surveillance capabilities, all that, they are improving exponentially, which is why I don't think the Chinese will really be in a position to go in for a conflict and hope for victory. That is not going to happen. Leave aside that, I have my very serious doubts if they can even take over Taiwan, let alone India. What we do with the United States, how we cooperate with them, what sort of intelligence sharing which we are doing, that I think is already a work in progress. And I presume a lot of conversation will have taken place on that. But for the moment, the trust deficit which Ambassador Gokhale talks about is no nearer resolution. It is not going to be resolved. So we will have to be prepared, continue with our defenses, and so long as we are there, I don't think the Chinese are in a position to carry out any major hostile activity. Thank you.
Thank you, Major General Dhruv Katoch. I apologize for the mistakes in introduction. I meant to say clause and somehow I ended up saying IDSA. Because I know I've interacted you while you were director of clause and I was trying to publish some articles on the clause website. So it just was one of my senior moments. Sorry about that. It's my pleasure and honor to invite Ambassador Anil Trigunayat to give his comments on Ambassador Vijay Gokhale's paper and give his own perspective from a diplomatic standpoint. So Ambassador Anil Trigunayat.
Thank you, Dr. Adityanji. It's a great pleasure and honor to be on your podcast, especially with such distinguished panelists as Brigadier Sagal and General Katoch, who have already touched upon nearly every dimension of the paper and every dimension of the problem that my friend Vijay Gokhale has mentioned in his very erudite paper. I must say that he is one of the few real experts on China as far as the diplomatic dimension is concerned. And he has come up with various practical suggestions. And I believe that his suggestions leave aside the de-escalation, the disengagement, de-induction, etc. But what he says in the end, those suggestions are worth pursuing by the government. And I'm quite sure they might be doing it if they are not doing it already. Because we would need to create necessary and sufficient deterrence across the LAC. And these practical and implementable suggestions must be pursued in right earnest. Now, China, as far as it's concerned, is my view is, so I think that this paper is superb. It gives ideas. It opens up certain more dimensions to be considered. But the onus of normalization or settling the border does not rest only on India. It is in China as well. And the fact remains is that China is known to be stabbing us in the back all the time, from Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai days down to the Galwan. They do not respect the agreements they have themselves signed, negotiated. They believe in violation of it. And I think that till we have sorted out this problem of balance of comprehensive power and balance of all inclusive interests, which is a gigantic task, given the certain differential between our powers, I don't think that China is going to be a benign neighbor at any stage. In my view, the China is going to be our challenge in every geography going forward. It is what wants to contain India within South Asia, but is not able to do so. Now, trust deficit is something which is extremely important between leaders. Now, we have seen large number of discussions, negotiations have been happening, both on the border now, post-Galwan, and prior to Galwan as well. Prime Minister himself has met, I believe, 19, 20 times President Xi Jinping. Now, if at that level we are not able to generate the kind of trust that is required, then I doubt very much that the other areas of the governance from China would be at all looking to. But the fact remains is that now they have begun to recognize India's power status, which they to a great extent would deny, not even considering it worthwhile or equal for a long time. But now in Global Times, we saw that article of Dr. Zhang, which mentions India in a very good light, frankly. And he says, and for the benefit of your the viewers, I would like to say that because it's a mouthpiece of the government of China, that it is saying that India has become an ascendant power, a confident Bharat, a key global economic player, and a strategic power, which is moving from multi-balancing to multi-alignment and now transforming into a pole. And they have often acknowledged the fact that India's continuing with this strategic autonomic approach, which generally China, for their own interest, have often lauded. So did Russia, for that matter. US may not like it because they only believe in alliance kind of an architecture. So from my point of view now, it's absolute and imperative that a credible deterrence is maintained at all levels. Now we do also have to think about something else, which I believe in the paper does not touch upon. It just deals in a binary context of a bilateral mechanisms, the bilateral developments. But the global churn that is taking place, the Sino-US competition, the Russia-US-Ukraine war, and the outcome of that, which might lead to a bipolar world in a Cold War 2.0 kind of a context. Where does India, what is the incentive that China will have to normalize ties with India that is getting closer to the US by the day? Now, that is something that I find is going to be a very important consideration for our strategy going forward. Now, China does not need to fight us on the border. As General Katoch mentioned, the gray zone warfare provides you an asymmetric advantage. And while in India we are still working on our communication strategies, I believe that China has mastered it and has been a master of it for a long time. They do not consider India as a real competitor. They are looking to displace the United States as a numero uno power. But they don't want India to be so big that it can challenge it. And it's already begun to challenge, which they are admitting now, which is a very important thing. So while this political trust is a prerequisite for any kind of a normalization or de-induction, de-escalation, or whatever it is there, I believe that this is something that is going to be a very, very difficult situation. Now, the Ambassador Gokhale has suggested three-pronged approach: negotiations with China to stabilize the border areas, building deterrence and infrastructure at the border, and holding adequate reserves in the rear. Now, this kind of a thing is doable within a normal circumstance. But when China objects to every time you try to build up your infrastructure on the border, whenever you are doing anything, exercises on your side, they are always objecting to this. Forget about stabilizing the border. They come up with the new areas which they try to claim as their own. So I don't think that we are looking at a very congenial kind of scenario, especially in the current transitional global order, where one does not know where we are going to head it. Now the West Asia is going to be a very difficult scene already. I think that our policy as of now has been not the business as usual. It cannot be until and unless the pre-Galwan situation is achieved. We are also working simultaneously. And I believe so that with the competition with cooperation, minus conflict, that has been India's approach. And I don't think we have abdicated that. So whether it is through Russia under the RIC context, with the BRICS, SCO and others, we have to continue to engage with China on those areas where it directly impacts us. Another dimension that we need not forget is that China does not again need to directly needle us. They have Pakistan as its proxy, which is another big problem for us. Terrorism is a major problem, and China becomes hand in glove with them and tries to protect their terrorists at the UN and all, which also opens up a new front forever for you. Now, that is something that we need to be very, very careful and continue to work with them. Now, in his own paper, he has quoted some of these reports, like CSI's report, that Beijing is not contemplating a border retreat from the border. That is a confirmative thing. So which also says that it's not going to do that so easily. And it also says that China has a decisive superiority and wants to wrest control of Yangtze Heights from Indian border forces, which has been, of course, fortunately decried by both Brigadier Sahgal and General Katoch as far as India's military preparedness is concerned. I hope all that is very true. And he also says that the border forces transgressions will continue rather frequently. That will continue to trigger escalations. So what we have to do, we have to frankly, one more point before I said we also need to probably analyze whether the other major powers have an interest in seeing to it that India and China both go to a war, whereby both get receded to by 20 years each, and those other powers continue to reign supreme. Because the economic pivot is moving towards south, towards India and China. Newer groups are coming up. Weaponization of financial instruments is leading to slowly de-dollarization. So I would like to think that we would have to upgrade and match eyeball to eyeball, not if then border infrastructure, the force compatibility, so that the news that China is trying to put us towards us is strategically removed for good. So as of now, when you read it, when you see the situation, there are a lot of ifs and buts. But as Dr. Jaishankar often mentions, his 3M's approach, that there should be mutual respect, mutual interest, and mutual sensitivities. So unless those three are there and respect for the agreements China has already signed, I would not see the kind of a normal behavior that you expect between or among these states. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Anil Trigunayat. And all our three distinguished panelists have made excellent comments in their opening statements. And we'll have a few questions to all our distinguished panelists. I will start with Brigadier Arun Sagal.
Sure.
Brigadier Sagal, you ended up your presentation from putting a question to quote unquote our friends in the United States as to what level they will come in India's support in the eventuality of a India-China hot war. Keeping in mind the behavior of United States as a superpower, at least in last 3 decades, and extrapolating from that behavior, do you think it's a wise strategy to rely on quote unquote the benign support of United States, because United States cares only for one country, and that is United States. United States has a behavior pattern of use and throw their quote unquote allies at various points in time till it becomes inconvenient for the United States. So when we are already witnessing this kind of behavior in the international arena, to put our eggs in one basket, how much justified it would be, Brigadier Sagal?
Okay. Okay. I think the context of my remark is has been was not there. I mean, what basically there are three issues that I'm trying to raise. One is that in perception of the Chinese, and for that I'm 100% sure. I deal a lot with the Chinese and track to at other issues. In the perception of the Chinese, the US factor matters. Okay. Now the second issue is, how does the US factor play out? The US factor plays out is that if the United States believes that there is a second player in Indo-Pacific who has the capacity, capability for constraining China, not containing, I'm using my word carefully, constraining China, that is India. And therefore, under circumstances where there is a direct challenge to the India on our borders, and I did not mention it in that many clear terms. So the second is that we have a second front opening up in the maritime domain. With 2025, the Chinese will have 4 aircraft carriers operational. So we will have a separate game, and maritime domain will also come into play in a bigger way. The point which I'm trying to make is this, that if there is a security architecture focused around quadrilateral, which is currently East Asia specific, we keep telling our American interlocutors, which we do a lot in our bilateral dialogues, is to say that there has to be an Indian Ocean strategy. And in that Indian Ocean strategy, there has to be a clarity to us of the kind of cooperative mechanisms that we can put in place in our India's threat mitigation. I am not for a moment asking the United States to come to our aid. That's not a right word to use, and that's not what I have ever intended. Thirdly, if you read the latest defense development policy of the Americans, which just came out 2 days back, they are looking at 5 players of capacity building for dealing with the Chinese challenge in Asia. And in addition to these 4 allies, that is Korea, Japan, Australia, and the United States itself, it is looking at India as a co-developer and as part of the armament development capacities and capabilities. We need to capitalize on that. I'm not saying we need to do anything. We need to capitalize. It is in their interest right now. Please understand, this world scenario, operational scenario, the war scenario is hanging on one item, It's called 155 millimeter ammunition. Every buyer in the world, everybody scraping the courtyard to look at 155 ammunition. कहाँ पे है? क्यों नहीं है? कहाँ पे चली गई? So the bottom line today is this: the Americans realize that their stocks are low, their capacities are low. They have to build up additional capacities everywhere. So it's not a matter of favor it is doing to me. So if I am in a strategic partnership with somebody, I have some expectations, I have some understanding, and I have to have a certain degree of a credible assurances. I'm not say credible, but certain degree of assurances that something will. So to that extent, I think the Chinese will always factor the America, whether we factor it or not, whether we are conservative on this issue or not. This is our problem. But as far as the Chinese are concerned, they will factor into it, and they will factor it in, and particularly my recent paper, which I just sent you, Indo-US US-China strategic competition and its implication of the strategic balance in Indo-Pacific, I have highlighted this fact. I highlighted this fact is that the Chinese are aware of the fact that the bigger, larger narrative is coming together of these players is to contain China, and this is important for us. And therefore, I think we need to be, if we are not factoring it, I'm not saying we should go on our own. That's not a good strategy at all. We need to factor credible inputs from our partners. Otherwise, what the hell are partners for? Like we take certain degree of support from the Russians, for example. External Affairs Minister went to Russia when we got some degree of support. We got to get two other batteries again. We need some other elements which I will not discuss openly. There are certain issues which we have got some assurances. So we need to get those assurances, and we will get those assurances. So my point at issue is, rather than United States fighting the Chinese in the Taiwan Strait, and there is a major conflict or a reasonable conflict on the continental domain where the Americans can give a bloody nose through India to the Chinese, why wouldn't they do it? I'm simply asking this question. So the question basically is, they can do it in Ukraine, they can do it to us. So my point is, we need to factor that. I'm not saying take it blindly. I'm not saying that it will happen. But I'm simply trying to say is, that must be a point of discourse with the Americans. Otherwise, there is nothing known as strategic partnership. There has to be a discourse, is my view. Thank you.
Thank you, Brigadier Sagal, for elucidating your point of view, and that is very well taken. Just needed a clarification from a different perspective. My second question goes to Major General Dhruv Katoch. General Katoch, while talking about Chinese postures, you mentioned that China is a past master of information warfare, and they are going to use electronics and space warfare also as their tools vis-a-vis India. I think as far as conventional balance of power is concerned, India has already started to work out in terms of building infrastructure and building capacities. But there's a huge asymmetry as far as space and electronic warfare is concerned, despite our ISRO launching 5 remote sensing satellites. The specific issue I am going to bring forth is the AI, artificial intelligence, use of robotic soldiers, and non-kinetic weapons. You remember that Brigadier Sagal was talking about that, there are problems in China, the morale of the PLA is low, they are not very happy with confrontation with India. The casualty rate is high. So China is going to capitalize more on the asymmetry in the areas where they have superiority rather than use conventional forces or conventional means. Kindly unmute yourself. General Katoch. Any comments on use of robotic soldiers, AI, and non-kinetic weapons?
Right. The way I've looked at it is, as far as the Chinese troops, their ground forces who are fighting on the LAC, they may be, some of them are very close, some of them are deployed about 20 to 30 kilometers behind. But let us look at it in a slightly different way. Most of them belong to the mainland, well in depth in China. So to them, home is more than 1,000 or 2,000 kilometers away. Not Tibet. Tibet is not home for them. So when they come to Tibet, it's a punishment posting. And they will have challenges when they go there. Now, what can China do about it? Artificial intelligence, robotic soldiers. Ultimately, in the mountains, when you go, if you're holding on to the mountains, you will require troops. The final battle is won by the infantryman. All other battles, like when I spoke of electronic warfare, space warfare, information warfare, those are the start points. The end point is a physical assault to capture those mountains. The ground is held, the mountains are held. Those troops will have to be evicted. What China can do, if they are looking at other means, non-kinetic means, you don't have to fight in the mountains. You can do it in the Mumbai Stock Exchange. You can do it against the Indian Railways. You can do it at our financial institutions. You can put all those things down. But then China must remember it can be done to them also. They may be better than us, but we are not lagging too far behind. So if they carry out warfare of this nature, and we know they have done it, it can be traced back to them, then they should be prepared for retaliation also. That is why, one of the people, when people said, why have we done the anti-satellite test? This is one of the reasons why we did it. It is so important to tell the Chinese we have a deterrence. If you take out our satellites, because ultimately all warfare today is dependent on satellites for information, for surveillance, for any other means. So if you take out our satellites, we have the capacity to take out yours. That is where the deterrence comes in. So I don't think China is going to go on that path. Ultimately, there will be, if it has to be a conflict, China has to be very certain of winning that conflict, of winning that war. As of now, I don't think they have that confidence levels. And simply relying on means other than hard power. By hard power, I mean, the physical assault by troops and by munitions, destruction of areas. They will have to rely on that at some stage. They cannot simply rely on electronic warfare or on the missile capability. And we have adequate deterrent capability there too, though I agree with you, the Chinese have got an edge as far as that is concerned. But we have an edge as far as air capabilities are concerned. Because when the Indian Air Force has to take on the PLAF, they don't have to take on the entire Chinese Air Force. We have to simply take them on over the Tibetan Plateau. So when we talk of force levels, we are only talking of the Tibetan Plateau, Tibet. What can we do in Tibet? What can the Chinese do? What force can they bring? What force can we bring? So to that extent, I think we are reasonably okay today. But it is again my belief that we will have to ensure certain level of superiority in the air and increased capacities as far as space and electronic warfare is concerned. Once we do that, I think we can be reasonably certain that we can avoid a direct conflict or a prolonged conflict like the Russia-Ukraine war between India and China on the LAC.
So, General Katoch, I agree with you. I'm not looking at a time frame of 5 years or 10 years. China is a perennial threat adversary at this point in time. And that situation is not going to resolve. And as far as I understand, China has a very strong initiative in developing a robotic soldiers army. That's the specific concern I have. Keeping in mind that the superiority they have in the domain of artificial intelligence, even United States is concerned about future development of a robotic army by China. And that's what I'm concerned about.
No, I take that point, but when I'm looking at the ultimate aim of what China wishes to achieve in the mountains, I think the use of robotics, etc. Perhaps it may be more appropriate to use them for air forces, to fly the fighter aircraft to perhaps for certain ground equipment, etc. But not more than that. I mean, the mountains are different. It's a very vast terrain, and if it is simply a question of using robotics to create a little bit of disturbance in certain selected spots, perhaps yes. But on the entire borderline, on the LAC, I have very serious reservations on that, despite the fact that China may be very advanced as far as robotics and AI is concerned.
Okay. My next question goes, Brigadier Sagal wants to join me. Brigadier Sagal?
Just small point. All the robotics and all is a very good concept. It's a good AI conceptualization. But all these things are being tried out in Ukraine, and as we understand, and only today I was reading in Economist that the Russians have overcome this entire issue of how to beat the Ukrainian defenses using their drone technology. They upgraded their technology sensor. So, when we are talking about capacities and capabilities in a certain field, we also must take cognizance of what are the counter capabilities that are taking place. And AI, fielding AI soldiers, robotic soldiers, is a concept that will take a few years to come about. I mean, it's not a concept which can come about tomorrow morning or day after, and we have to understand what is the capacity, what can they do, etc. And we are also doing some trials of in terms of our fully modernized. General Katoch will tell me this FN, let's see, Indian infantry soldiers with the new kinds of all kinds of equipment that we are trying to provide with them so that they can fight this kind of operation. My second point is that India has already initiated the program of developing an operational missile force. And we have already taken some decisions in that regard. And it is to be noted that we will have an operational missile capability deployed latest by end of 2025, initially in limited numbers, and thereafter building up on that. So, it's so now when we face with the Chinese threat, it's not going to be on the border, sir. It's going to be across the board. So Chinese will have to fight in a multi-domain, multi-spectrum level of threat from us. So that's something which I just wanted to highlight. It's a work in being. It probably come through by 2030 in large numbers, but that's the nature of the beast. We are not going to fight a war. We try and avoid it, but if the Chinese force it on us, then Chinese has to force it on us with the current capabilities. And like everybody has brought out, we are adequately prepared to deal with those current capabilities. That's my point. Sorry for intervention.
So basically, we are speaking in the same vein.
Yes, I'm just reinforcing.
Long-term planning, instead of being reactive, be proactive. That was the point I was trying to make.
Sure, absolutely.
My next question goes to Ambassador Trigunayat. Ambassador Trigunayat, you mentioned that the Prime Minister met Xi Jinping at least 18, 19 times. And if that level of leadership level of meetings did not resolve the mutual trust, then probably mutual trust is not going to be resolved under the current circumstances. And if that is the lesson we have learned, we have also learned that China uses distraction techniques quite a lot. We have had a particular mechanism called SREP mechanism, Special Representative Mechanism, in which the National Security Advisor of India and from Chinese side, a special rep who is usually the state counselor. There have been 3 of them. They have been meeting and there have been at least 22 rounds of talks. Why not end this charade? Is diversionary tactic, and by ending this charade, you send a message. You are not going to do a diplomatic downgrade, withdraw your ambassador, but this useless mechanism, starting with J.N. Dikshit, M.K. Narayanan, Shiv Shankar Menon, now Ajit Doval. Ajit Doval has met both Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi. Countless of times, there have been more than 22 bilateral special rep or SR mechanism meetings. There's no achievement. Scrap it off. Would you or Ambassador Gokhale take my blunt point of view and convey it to the government?
Dr. Aityanji, the thing is, what we are talking about is a conflict kind of a situation. And this conflict kind of a situation is an abnormal situation. It is not a normal. So that's where you require diplomatic interventions, irrespective of whether there is peacetime or wartime. The diplomacy continues there. And therefore, these kind of institutionalized mechanisms somehow prevent a full-fledged warfare. That is also possible. And I mentioned briefly about this, that in case the war is forced upon us, China, as has been mentioned by others, at the moment is not interested in going to war. Not because they cannot or they do not overestimate themselves. But the fact is that in the larger scheme of things, in my view, China wants a few years of peace to become the numero that they want to become a technological superpower, even if not a military superpower, an economic superpower. That is their game plan. And in that game plan, they are not interested in going to war or acquire Taiwan immediately or go into India full-fledged way. But they have other means of troubling us. That is guerrilla warfare, not issuing visas to people from Arunachal, saying you are our country and this, that, those kind of things. In a democracy, these rattle us. But in China, these are not a factor. So we have to find ways where we continue that kind of engagement. It is not a charade. They have reached a certain level, even though even our forces, WMCC, those mechanisms which are there, they have been meeting 20 odd times. But the fact remains is that there is some kind of a communication, because India is also not looking to war, because we are exactly in the same situation. We are on an upward trajectory. So we are not settling the border issues by war, which will not be done. There are no winners in today's war. If at all you see the Russia-Ukraine war, where Russia is pitted against the whole of the West, including the United States, and been nowhere. You are seeing Israel-Hamas war. Israel, which defeated 6 major powers in the Middle East in 6 days war, has taken 96 days to just decimate Hamas, which they have not successfully done today. So the situation is, the course to that is having institutionalized mechanism whereby they can diffuse it from going into a full throttle warfare. That's what my view is.
So I'll take a supplementary on that. My idea of actually scrapping this mechanism does not mean either or situation that have a hot war immediately. That is not what I'm advocating. I'm just suggesting that we use messaging and signaling by scrapping this mechanism, because there are other, you have an embassy there, you have both countries have their embassies, they have their ambassadors. This is a kind of diversionary tactic. And if you see the relationship bilaterally, China has always used the needling. There's hardly any time we have done the needling. We are always passive recipient of Chinese needling, whether that is on LAC, whether that is vis-a-vis Pakistan, whether that is in a maritime domain, whether that is on terrorism in FATF. We always are in a reactive mode. And all I am saying is that looking at the cost benefit analysis, if Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi 20 meetings could not undo the mutual distrust, just as a messaging, as a signal, scrap this mechanism, it's just to show that we do have a spine. I'm not saying going to war as an
No,
alternative.
no, not going to war. Even I did not mean, but that is something that does happen. And very often there are not even reasons because of which the wars happen. We have seen it. There are geopolitical contestations. But at the same time, I feel that these mechanisms serve their purpose. But I agree with you totally that sometimes you have to send the message. Now, what Ambassador Gokhale has mentioned is essentially is propagating that we need to, how we can resort to settling this border issue that has been festering. And the premise is that perhaps it's only simply because of the border issue that we have this conflicting situation with them.
Oh, true.
I presume that it is not the case.
Yes.
The case is different. I mean, now the geopolitical situation is very different. India is a very different kind of a country, which is have a very different ambitions, which is where China wants to clog you down into this thing. So whether these mechanisms are there or not there, I think that the newer determinants in this relationship are cropping up, and those need to be addressed in a more innovative manner. We are, as has been mentioned, that we are developing those capabilities if we don't have some. But I'm quite sure that we are capable to defend ourselves, and China has seen it now in Galwan for the last 2 years, 3 years. So they understand it, and that's why they feel that India is one country, and as Brigadier Sagal mentioned, is capable of constraining them on this, both in the continental and the maritime domain, at least. But we need to keep up our capabilities in every single field, maybe as a part of deterrence, because India does not want any offensive capabilities at the moment. I mean, this is not our policy, irrespective. But we need to be able to defend ourselves, both diplomatically, internationally, bilaterally with China, and regionally also, because there are now, we cannot ignore what is happening in SCO, what is happening in BRICS. Those are the organizations, we are very much part of it, where China is expanding its greater influence. So we need to counter them there as well. So this is what I'm saying. I mean, the charter is very big at the moment, and it is not predicated only on our border dispute.
Brigadier Sagal wants to join in.
Yeah, I just want to make 2 quick points, sir. Post the San Francisco summit, the Chinese have had discussions. They started the security dialogue with Korea and Japan in Busan on 25th of November. The security dialogue took place, and thereafter, prior to that, the Prime Minister of Australia, Albanese, had gone off and resolved all the outstanding issues. The only country of consequence, and prior to that, the Chinese have been interacting with the Indonesians. The only country of consequence where the Chinese have not politically made a move of resolution, restoration, or cooperation is India. We need to understand these signals. These signals are very important. Number 2, I believe that I am conscious of the special representative program. I had the privilege with 2 of our representatives on a couple of bilateral track 2 meetings with the Chinese on this issue, etc. But my take is we need to send a message, whether SR is the message, not a message, but we need to tell them. The propagating that we will not talk till such time there is a border issue is controlled, etc., etc. It's become a hackneyed kind of a narrative. It doesn't make a difference to the Chinese. They said okay, but the question is, what is the new narrative? We have to, and it's always a battle of narratives. The battle of narratives going out right now is this: is when the world discusses the Chinese assertions, Chinese gray zone operations, gray zone everything, world does not by and large bring in the continental border skirmish, border intrusion by China into the front page or the front of those discourses. We are not. You write to see any American writing or any Western writing, those discourses are not coming to play. We need to bring it onto the front stage. We need to say that if there has to be an Indo-Pacific strategy, if there has to be a peace and stability in Indo-Pacific, it is not only maritime oriented. It has to be a continental constraints of the Chinese. And not only Chinese are doing continental constraint to us directly on the border. Chinese are also moving into our flanks. The our eastern neighborhood as well as our western neighborhood are being inundated by the Chinese. And tomorrow they are going to move into the maritime space. So the question basically is this: is totality of security architecture which we need to think through with our strategic partners. Otherwise, India cannot do it everything all alone, all on its own. Please understand that. I'm very clear on that. We can have a containing capability. We do not have beyond that, which leads to the interesting aspect of escalation by misunderstanding. But that I will leave it out. But the point we have to understand, put across to our partners is this: the partnerships are not for talking and discussions and on meetings. There has to be substantive issues, and the substantiveness has to come out. So that is a point which we need to have. Like, for example, the agreement on fast tracking of equipment, etc., to India as part of the ITR consideration which the Americans are having right now on the GE 414 engines, they have to be sorted through. They have to think it through. Otherwise, India will have to rethink our strategy and capacities, rethink its strategy. So my point is that we are, as the ambassador rightly pointed out, we are in an interconnected world. It's a geopolitical construct that we are living under. And within that geopolitical construct, we have to highlight our standing, and our partners have to understand our constraints and our aspirations. It cannot be only we have to worry about what happens to the United States, or what happens to Japan, or what happens to Korea. No. It has to also be what happens to India. And India is concerned that they are not doing enough. Thank you. I'm sorry. I get very
Brigadier
excited
Sagal.
about these things.
Thank you, General Katoch, and thank you, Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, for your participation.
Thank you.
Before I close, because we are running short of time, I'll just make comment using my advantage as the moderator. For all those who read the Global Times editorial by op-ed piece by Dr. Zhang, it is just a Chinese lullaby. Don't believe in a word of it. Never believe in a word of it. It's a diversionary tactic. But we need to be prepared for all eventualities. Not tomorrow, not in 5 years' time, not in 10 years' time. In geopolitics, our landscape is much long lasting, so need to prepare for that. With that, we will end this discussion. My thanks to my distinguished panelists. My thanks also to my team, Mr. Rajiv Verma and Mr. Ripudaman Pachori, who continuously help me day in, day out to make these kind of discussions possible. Just an announcement for the future. On January 28th, Saturday, we'll have a distinguished lecture, and that would be on the topic of, is Maldives a permanent security threat for Bharat? So we should have an interesting discussion following that lecture. Till that time, goodbye. And I hope everyone benefited from this discussion. It would be available on our YouTube channel within next hour or so. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.